My name is Marjorie Cole. I'm 62 years old, a retired elementary school teacher, and I've lived by the coast of Brookhaven, Maine, for most of my life. 7 years ago, I buried my husband and promised myself I would keep our values alive: kindness, humility, and grace, no matter how loud the world became. That promise echoed in my heart the morning I dressed for my son's wedding, holding a small silver frame wrapped in cream paper. I wanted the gift to carry meaning, not price. The ballroom shimmered under chandeliers, alive with music and laughter. Guests in gowns and tuxedos filled every seat, clinking glasses as my son, Nathan, stood at the altar with his bride, Sienna. She was stunning, poised, confident, her family seated in a row that gleamed with designer fabrics and diamond pins. When the time came for gifts, a hush of curiosity swept through the crowd. The staff rolled out a long table covered in white linen, stacked with glossy boxes and ribbons that whispered wealth. My little package, no bigger than a loaf of bread, looked almost fragile among them. Sienna's maid of honor handed it to her, smiling politely. From Nathan's mother. Sienna's manicured fingers peeled back the paper, and the room waited. The silver gleamed softly under the lights, a simple frame engraved with 5 quiet words. Forever begins humbly. For a heartbeat, silence lingered. Then came a laugh, sharp, light, almost careless. "Is this antique junk?" she said, holding the frame as if it might stain her gloves. A ripple of uneasy laughter followed, echoing around the hall. A few guests looked away. Nathan froze, half smiling, half stunned. I stood still, hands clasped before me, my heart drumming beneath layers of satin and restraint. I could feel the heat rise behind my eyes, but I only smiled. Small, steady, practiced. The kind of smile that comes from years of teaching children to use their words kindly, even when others don't. What Sienna didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the ocean-front resort they had chosen for this grand wedding, the place she had adored in every brochure and tour, belonged to me. I had paid the $92,000 she requested for her dream ceremony, not because she demanded it, but because my son had looked at me with hope, and I wanted love to begin without debt or resentment. As her laughter faded, I could almost hear my husband's voice, calm and certain, whispering the line he used to repeat whenever we were overlooked. True worth never needs to shout. So, I smiled and nodded when she thanked me with a smirk, as though charity had been done. Some moments bruise quietly, like waves against a dock, soft enough to ignore, strong enough to leave marks. I looked around the room and saw 100 eyes watching, measuring, assuming. To them, I was a modest widow offering a token of sentiment because I had nothing else to give. None of them guessed that I owned not only this resort, but 12 small rentals along the coast, each one built from decades of patient saving, every dollar earned from lesson plans and after-school tutoring. I didn't need them to know, but I needed to remember who I was. She laughed, but she didn't know the resort she adored stood under my name. Moments like this test the heart. It's easy to respond with pride, to correct, to defend. But sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is remain still. Let time reveal what words cannot. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've watched someone mistake your humility for weakness, you'll understand what I felt then. Keep watching, because the quiet ones always have more to say. A waiter passed by with champagne. Nathan reached for a glass, his hand trembling slightly. His eyes met mine, full of apology he couldn't voice. I gave him a nod, gentle, forgiving. There would be time later for truth, for lessons, for grace, but not tonight. Tonight, I would let the laughter echo, let the room right its assumptions, and let silence be my witness. Sienna moved on, lifting the next gift, a velvet box glimmering under the lights. The crowd leaned in again, attention shifting like a tide. I stepped back from the table, finding my seat near the edge of the hall. From there, I could see everything: the glint of the chandelier, the shimmer of her gown, the frame resting quietly on a side table, forgotten already. Yet I knew it would outlast every ribbon, every crystal, every performance of grandeur. I folded my napkins slowly, pressing the crease with my thumb. Sometimes dignity is as simple as that, holding your posture when someone tries to bend you. Outside, through the tall glass windows, the Atlantic spread in silver sheets beneath the dusk. The wind moved softly against the glass, carrying salt and memory. I watched the horizon and thought of the day Thomas and I first saw this property, how we'd stood barefoot on the sand, imagining laughter, music, life. He wanted it to be a place for beginnings. I smiled faintly. He would have loved this scene, the irony, the lesson unfolding beneath chandeliers. As applause rose again for another gift, I whispered to myself, "Forever begins humbly." It wasn't just a line on silver. It was a compass, a reminder that grace, when tested, becomes strength. And while the world clapped for luxury, I chose silence, because soon silence would speak louder than anything else. The morning after the wedding broke quiet and pale, the kind of stillness that only exists by the sea. Sunlight crept through lace curtains and brushed the framed photographs that lined my mantel. Children I had taught long ago, their gap-toothed smiles still brimming with promise. I moved slowly through the kitchen, the soft click of the kettle keeping rhythm with the tide beyond my window. The silver frame sat on the counter where I'd left it, its engraving glinting faintly in the dawn light. Forever begins humbly. It felt almost poetic that the gift mocked in front of strangers should be the first thing to greet me now. I traced a finger along its edge, remembering the way Sienna had held it, as if it were a relic from a forgotten thrift store. I thought of how quickly a crowd can decide someone's worth, how fast laughter can become a measure of value. Yet the ocean outside whispered something older, wiser, steady as breath. What's true doesn't need to shout. After breakfast, I stepped onto the porch with my cup of tea. The air smelled of salt and pine, familiar and grounding. Across the road, gulls drifted over the dunes, and the waves rolled in gentle applause. This was my rhythm now. Retirement days marked not by meetings or bells, but by wind and water, by tending to the small garden that crept along my fence line. A cluster of sea anemones had bloomed near the gate, bright and stubborn, their petals turned toward the sun. I admired their quiet persistence. Inside, on the bookshelf beside my favorite armchair, rested a letter sealed in wax. My husband, Thomas, had left it there 7 years ago, the day before his surgery. He'd smiled, pressed it into my hands, and said, "Open it when the world feels too loud." I had never found the right moment. Somehow, keeping it closed felt like keeping him near, a promise waiting patiently. Thomas was a man of gentle pride, a carpenter who believed the shape of a life could be carved through steady hands and honest days. We had built everything together, one small decision at a time, teaching by day, sanding boards by night, saving each check like seeds in a jar. When we bought our first duplex, we slept on the floor with nothing but a borrowed lamp and a shared dream, to give Nathan a life free from the scraping struggle we had known. Over the decades, those jars of savings became homes, and those homes became a quiet portfolio of rentals tucked along the coast. Each mortgage paid felt like one more stone laid in a foundation we could stand on. When Thomas passed, I promised him I'd keep building, slowly, humbly, the way we always had. I've never flaunted it, not because I'm ashamed, but because wealth built from work feels different from wealth born of display. My neighbor saw a widow who clipped coupons, who drove an old sedan, who brought pies to church socials. They didn't see the spreadsheets on my desk, the property deeds filed neatly in my drawer, or the checkbooks balanced down to the penny. They didn't need to. Yesterday reminded me how quickly humility can be mistaken for lack. Watching Sienna's laughter ripple through that ballroom felt like stepping back into my first years of teaching, when parents would glance at my scuffed shoes and assume I had nothing to offer, until they saw their children read for the first time. Worth isn't worn. It's lived. I lifted the letter again, running my thumb across the seal. It was marked with his initials, TC, pressed deep into burgundy wax. I wanted to open it, to hear his voice again, but the moment wasn't right yet. The lesson wasn't finished. Instead, I set it beside the frame, the two symbols of our marriage, one from the beginning, one from the end, each a reminder that dignity doesn't fade with time. The frame carried a message for the next generation. The letter carried one for me. The phone rang, pulling me back from thought. It was Nathan, his voice thin with apology. "Mom, about last night." "I know," I said softly. "It's all right, Nathan." "It's not," he insisted. "She didn't mean—" "She meant what she felt," I interrupted gently. "And feelings can change when truth catches up." There was a pause, the kind that holds more love than words. "You don't have to fix this," I added. "Just remember what matters. That's all I've ever wanted for you." After we hung up, I returned to my chair, watching light shift across the floorboards. The world outside carried on, gulls circling, waves folding over themselves, life renewing. Somewhere deep inside, a calm certainty stirred. Humiliation fades, but humility roots itself. It grows in silence, nourished by patience, watered by grace. I set my tea aside and opened my planner, flipping past grocery lists and garden notes. On the last page, I wrote a line I hadn't dared until now. "Reclaim what's yours, not in anger, but in truth." The pen hovered, steady. A plan was forming, quiet as dawn, strong as tide. 2 days after the wedding, Nathan called and asked if we could meet for coffee before he returned to Boston. I agreed, choosing the small cafe near the marina, the one with chipped blue tables and the smell of cinnamon that lingered in every corner. The morning was bright but cool, the kind of spring air that carried both warmth and distance. I arrived early, as I often did, settling by the window where sunlight could find me. The silver frame rested in my tote, its weight a quiet reminder. When Nathan walked in, he looked older than his 32 years, shoulders hunched beneath a suit jacket that still carried confetti on its sleeve. "Mom," he said softly, sliding into the seat across from me. "You didn't have to come all this way." "I wanted to," I replied, smiling. "We didn't get much time to talk during all the excitement." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "About the gift, Sienna didn't mean—" "I know," I said, stirring my tea. "Weddings bring out nerves. Sometimes nerves sound like laughter." He smiled, grateful for the grace I offered so freely. But I saw the flicker of unease behind his eyes, the silent conflict of a man standing between two loyalties. I decided to spare him the struggle. I reached into my bag and placed a small envelope on the table. "What's this?" he asked. "It's the final payment," I said gently. "For the wedding." He blinked. "Mom, you already—" I promised I'd handle it. 92,000, all in. His mouth fell open slightly. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," I repeated. "Love should begin without debt." He looked down at the check, tracing the numbers as if they might vanish under his touch. "You shouldn't have used your savings," he murmured. I folded my hands around my cup. Nathan, do you remember the first summer you worked with your father? Painting that duplex? Scrubbing the floors? He nodded slowly. Do you remember what he said every time you asked why we didn't hire help? He smiled faintly. He said, "We're building roots, not walls." Exactly, I said. Every bit we saved came from those roots. This isn't sacrifice, Nathan. It's legacy. Across the table, guilt softened into gratitude. But just as his expression eased, a shadow crossed the cafe window. Sienna stood outside, phone in hand, scanning the room. She spotted us and waved before stepping in, her heels clicking against the tile. "Hi," she said brightly, leaning down to kiss Nathan's cheek. "Sorry, traffic was a nightmare." Then her gaze fell on the envelope. "What's that?" Nathan hesitated. "Mom was just—" "I'm settling the bill," I said, offering the warmest smile I could manage. Sienna blinked. "The whole thing? But I thought you'd already given what you could." Her words were light, almost innocent, but the edge beneath them was sharp. I met her eyes, calm and unflinching. "It's paid in full," I said. She opened the envelope, eyes widening at the figure. "This is your entire retirement, isn't it?" I shook my head gently. "Just a portion of what I've built." She looked skeptical, glancing at Nathan as though waiting for him to correct me. When he didn't, she let out a soft laugh. "Well, that's very generous," she said, sliding the envelope back. "We'll make sure to send you updates from the honeymoon suite." Her tone carried that same shimmer of condescension I'd heard at the wedding. Pity wrapped in politeness. I smiled anyway, steady and measured. "I hope it brings you both joy," I said. "That's all a parent can wish for." Nathan reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "Thank you, Mom, truly." I squeezed back, letting my touch say what words could not. Sienna's phone buzzed, and she excused herself to take the call. Through the glass, I watched her step outside, laughing softly, her reflection merging with the marina behind her, the same docks where Thomas and I had once stood, dreaming of the future. The scene shimmered with irony, but I stayed still, breathing in the scent of cinnamon and salt. When she returned, she kissed Nathan's temple. "I'll wait in the car," she said sweetly. "We've got appointments in the city." Then to me, "Take care, Mrs. Cole. And thank you again for everything." After she left, silence settled between us. Nathan stared down at his coffee, then up at me, eyes full of something unspoken. "You've always given more than anyone sees," he whispered. I smiled faintly. "That's all right. The right people always notice eventually." He looked out the window, where Sienna stood scrolling through her phone, and sighed. "She'll learn, Mom. She just grew up different." "Different isn't wrong," I said gently. "It's just untested." The check remained on the table between us, a bridge built from faith and patience. I pushed it toward him. "Make sure it clears before the weekend," I said. He nodded, voice thick. "I will." As he rose to leave, I stayed seated, finishing my tea. Through the window, I watched the gulls trace lazy circles over the bay. They never rushed, never explained, yet always returned to the same place. I thought of that as I gathered my things, how some investments aren't measured in dollars, but in dignity. Before leaving, I slipped the receipt copy into my planner, beside a note I'd written days ago. "Reclaim what's yours." Not in anger, but in truth. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about value, what we teach, what we live, what we allow others to see. The week before the honeymoon, Sienna invited me to accompany her to finalize the last details for the reception venue. "It'll be quick," she said over the phone, her voice bright but distant. Just a few final touches. You've been such a help already. Help. The word hung in the air like a ribbon stretched too tight. I agreed anyway, hoping that proximity might build understanding. Sometimes grace requires showing up, even when you're unwelcome. The resort's grand hall gleamed that afternoon, sunlight spilling across polished floors. Staff hurried about, arranging crystal vases and folding napkins into elegant shapes I'd never seen in my years of hosting school fundraisers. I smiled, admiring the craftsmanship. "Isn't it gorgeous?" Sienna asked, waving toward the chandeliers. "Nathan and I wanted something timeless, not quaint." She glanced at me, her smile practiced. "You know how trends can date a place." I nodded, adjusting the strap of my handbag. "Yes, timelessness is always worth the investment." She blinked, then quickly changed the subject, leading me toward the florist. The woman behind the counter greeted us with a bright grin. "Mrs. Whitmore, everything's ready. Peonies, lilies, imported orchids, just like you requested." Sienna's tone softened to charm. "Lovely. This is my mother-in-law, Mrs. Cole. She's helping where she can." The florist's smile dimmed slightly, polite but assessing. "How sweet," she said. "You must be proud. It's not every day a teacher gets to see her son marry into such style." I returned her smile. Pride doesn't depend on style, but yes, I'm proud of my son. The florist laughed lightly, a sound too crisp to be kind. "Of course, every contribution counts." Sienna didn't notice. She was already flipping through photos of centerpieces on her phone. I stepped back, letting the moment pass, and made a mental note of the kindness I wouldn't find there. Our next stop was the caterer's tasting room. The air smelled of butter and truffle oil. A young chef placed samples before us, tiny sculptures of food balanced on porcelain spoons. Sienna leaned over the table. "Mother loves French cuisine," she said. "It's her favorite. I'm sure Marjorie's more comfort food oriented, right?" The chef smiled. "Oh, I understand. Simple, hearty dishes. The kind that remind you of home." I set my napkin on my lap and met his eyes. "I think food should remind you of gratitude, whatever the cuisine." He hesitated, unsure whether to nod or apologize. I spared him the confusion and offered a gentle smile. "These look wonderful," I said. "You've worked hard." He relaxed, grateful for the kindness. Not everyone learns that dignity is a language of its own. By the time we reached the decor consultant, I had grown familiar with the rhythm: compliment, correction, condescension. Each exchange polished my patience like sea glass. The consultant held up swatches of ivory silk. "We've reserved the premium linens for the Whitmore family tables," she said brightly, then glanced at her clipboard. "For Mrs. Cole's side, we've coordinated simpler settings. Something classic." Sienna nodded approvingly. "Perfect. It'll feel more natural for them." The phrase settled over me like dust. Them, as though kindness could be divided by table. I looked at the swatches, at the careful separation of texture and sheen, and thought of how often I'd been told what fit me, where I belonged, what I should wear, how I should live. I touched the simpler fabric, soft but strong beneath my fingers. "This will be fine," I said. "Grace doesn't need embroidery." Sienna smiled, relieved I hadn't made it awkward. The consultant scribbled a note and moved on. By the end of the afternoon, my feet ached from walking and my heart from holding steady. Sienna chatted about honeymoon itineraries, tossing around words like exclusive, luxury, elite. I listened, nodding, letting her paint her picture. As we stepped out into the parking lot, the sun dipped low, gilding the resort in gold. She paused beside her car. You've been wonderful through all this, she said. I know this isn't exactly your world. I smiled softly. Oh, you'd be surprised how much of this world I understand. She laughed, assuming humility. You're sweet. I watched her drive away, her convertible merging into traffic. The breeze carried the scent of salt and jasmine. I stood for a moment longer, looking up at the building that rose behind me, the same one my husband and I had signed for decades ago, when it was just a neglected inn with peeling paint and promise. Back then, no one saw what we saw, but vision doesn't need witnesses. It just needs time. As I walked to my car, I caught sight of Clara, the wedding planner, arranging flowers near the entrance. She offered a small nod, the kind that passes between people who see more than they say. Beautiful day, she called out. It is, I replied, and it's only beginning. Driving home, the horizon blushed pink over the water. The day's slights pressed gently against my chest, but they didn't break through. I'd learned long ago that politeness can sting as sharply as cruelty, and that silence, when chosen, is not weakness, but strategy. Each remark had left a mark, faint but deliberate, like chalk lines before a storm. And though no one else could see it, a quiet resolve had begun to take shape beneath the surface, steady, patient, waiting for its hour. By Monday, the laughter from the wedding had faded into whispers online. I hadn't expected much. A few photos, a cheerful caption, perhaps a polite thank you. But when I opened my phone after breakfast, the first thing that filled my screen was a post from Sienna's account. A carefully filtered photo of her holding Nathan's hand beneath the chandeliers, a table of roses blurred behind them. The caption read, "Grateful blue-collar love." We're so touched by every humble contribution that made our dream possible. True generosity shines brightest from the simplest hearts. There it was, humble contribution. A phrase polished smooth enough to sound kind, yet edged with pity sharp enough to cut. Below, the comments bloomed like weeds. She seems so sweet. Reminds me of my aunt, bless her heart. Beautiful story. Real kindness from working folks. I set my cup down slowly, the porcelain tapping against the saucer. Outside, gulls called across the sky, their cries carried on the wind. By noon, Mrs. Green was at my door. My neighbor had lived 2 houses down since Nathan was in high school, a kind woman with the curiosity of 10. She held a basket of muffins, her eyes bright with something between sympathy and intrigue. "Morning, Marjorie," she began, stepping onto the porch before I could invite her. "I saw the post. What a beautiful wedding. You must be so proud." "I am," I said softly, gesturing for her to sit. She handed me the basket, wrapped in gingham. "Blueberry. Still warm. Thought you could use a treat after all that excitement." "Thank you. That's thoughtful." She leaned forward, lowering her voice as if the seagulls might overhear. "People are saying the bride's family spared no expense. And you did what you could. Bless your heart. It's inspiring, really. Proof that love matters more than, well, money." The word hung between us, thick and sticky. I smiled gently. "Money's just a tool, Mrs. Green. How you use it says more than how much you have." She nodded, unsure whether it was agreement or confusion. "Oh, of course. Well, you've always been so modest. We all admire that." Modest. Another word dressed in lace, concealing judgment beneath its folds. I thanked her again for the muffins and saw her off, watching as she walked back down the path, already fishing her phone from her purse. Inside, the house felt smaller, the walls closing in with each echo of that post's phrasing. Humble contribution. I turned off my phone and set it face down on the table. When the noise outside grows too loud, the sea becomes my refuge. I grabbed my shawl and stepped out toward the shore, the air cool and bright with salt. Waves rolled in slow and steady, leaving ribbons of foam across the sand. I breathed deeply, letting the horizon stretch me back into proportion. Standing there, I thought of Thomas, how he'd built this life not for applause, but for endurance. How many times had we been underestimated? How many smiles had we worn through misunderstanding? His voice returned like a tide. Truth matures in silence. He'd said that once when a loan officer dismissed our business plan as ambitious for a school teacher. We hadn't argued. We'd just kept building. And years later, when that same bank asked to host their staff retreats at our newly restored resort, Thomas only smiled. "Patience outlasts pride," he'd whispered then. I turned the phrase over now, its weight familiar, steady. Truth doesn't need an audience, it only needs time. Back home, I called Evelyn. My oldest friend had a gift for seeing straight through words into meaning. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm, slightly amused. "So they've crowned you the patron saint of thrift?" I laughed, the sound soft but real. "Seems I've been promoted without my consent." "Let them talk," she said. "Wind always finds the loose shutters first." Her words drew a smile from me. "I know. Still, it stings a little." "Of course it does. You're human. But don't mistake chatter for truth. Truth doesn't trend. It lingers." I glanced at the unopened letter on my desk, its wax seal catching the late light. "He used to say that too," I murmured. "Then you already know what to do," Evelyn said. "Silence isn't surrender. It's strategy. Let time speak for you." We talked for a while longer, trading stories about our gardens, the way spring coaxed life from the stubborn soil. When we hung up, I sat in the quiet, the house settling around me like an old friend. On the table, Mrs. Green's muffins cooled beside my tea. I broke one open, steam curling upward, the scent of berries filling the room. For a moment, everything slowed. The gossip, the laughter, the sting. Outside, the tide was rising. I watched it from the window, each wave folding over the last, erasing, footprints, smoothing scars in the sand. The sea never defended itself. It just kept returning, steady and sure, until the shoreline forgot the insult. I took a slow sip of tea, the warmth spreading through my chest. Some stories are better told in silence, I thought. The truth would come. It always did. The dinner was meant to be a quiet celebration, a gathering of two families bound now by vows and photographs. Sienna had insisted on hosting it at her parents' home, a broad colonial perched above the harbor, where every wall gleamed with framed memories of a life lived larger than it was. I arrived early, bouquet in hand, and was greeted by Laurel's perfume before her voice. "Marjorie, dear," she exclaimed, ushering me in with a smile polished to perfection. "How lovely you could make it. We've prepared something simple tonight. Veal, truffle risotto, a little burgundy. You'll adore it." "Thank you," I said, handing her the flowers. "They're from my garden. Nothing fancy." "Charming," she replied, already turning toward the kitchen, where Sienna's laughter chimed above the clatter of silver. Nathan was setting the table, careful, quiet. He looked up when he saw me, his smile small but sincere. "Mom," he said softly, "I'm glad you came." I touched his shoulder. "So am I." The dining room glowed under a chandelier shaped like a cascade of glass tears. Every detail spoke of taste: sterling utensils, linen napkins, wine glasses lined like soldiers. I took my seat across from Sienna, beside a window that overlooked the water. Conversation drifted easily at first. Travel plans, honeymoon destinations, the promise of imported linens, and the scent of jasmine. I listened, offering small nods, answering when addressed. It wasn't until the third course that Laurel turned her attention to me fully. "So, Marjorie," she began, slicing into her veal, "Sienna tells me you used to teach. Such important work. My goodness, the patience you must have." "I loved every moment," I said. "Children teach us as much as we teach them." John chuckled, swirling his wine. "And now retirement. Must be quite an adjustment, living on, what do they call it? A fixed income?" The question landed softly, masked in curiosity. I smiled, placing my fork down. "I suppose it depends on what you've built beforehand." Laurel nodded absently, missing the undertone. "Well, we do admire simple living. So refreshing these days." Sienna reached for her glass. "We just want you to enjoy yourself, Marjorie. You've done enough. This is your time to relax, stay in your lane, let us handle the rest." The words slipped out smooth as silk, dressed in affection but edged with superiority. The table stilled for a heartbeat. Nathan's fork paused midair. I met her gaze, steady and calm. "My lane." She blushed slightly, laughing it off. "Oh, you know what I mean. Enjoy retirement, focus on hobbies, garden, bake. Leave the complicated things to us." Laurel nodded in agreement. "It's good advice, dear. These things can get overwhelming." I folded my napkin gently, smoothing the crease with my thumb. "It's true," I said softly. "Every lane leads somewhere. Some are quiet, but they reach farther than they appear." The silence that followed was thin but taut. Nathan cleared his throat. "Sienna, could you pass the bread?" "Of course," she said quickly, placing the basket down between us. Her smile was bright, brittle. I took a piece, breaking it slowly, the crust flaking beneath my fingers. Sometimes restraint speaks louder than reaction. Sometimes grace means letting the echo linger, just long enough to remind others of what they said. Dinner continued, polite again, though the edges had changed. I listened to talk of markets and mergers, their voices weaving around terms meant to impress. Laurel spoke of a country club membership under reconsideration, John of a potential investor. I offered no correction, no commentary. Let them keep their illusions. The truth would come in its own time. When dessert arrived, a delicate crème brûlée torched to golden glass, Sienna excused herself to take a call in the kitchen. Through the doorway, I could see her pacing, voice hushed but sharp. Nathan tried to fill the silence. "Mom, would you like more tea?" "Yes, please," I said. He poured carefully, the cup trembling slightly in his hand. He'd heard more than he'd wanted. Sons often do. As I sipped, the warmth spread through me, smoothing the chill her words had left. Stay in your lane. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to draw boundaries around me. The world likes boxes. It fears what doesn't fit. But Thomas and I had never lived inside one. We'd built our lane from scratch, poured every foundation ourselves, mapped each turn with patience and grit. When Sienna returned, she looked lighter, phone tucked away, charm restored. "Sorry about that. Work never stops," she said, reclaiming her seat. "No worries," I replied. "It's good to be dedicated. Success favors those who plan ahead." She smiled, uncertain whether I meant her or myself. As the evening ended, Laurel hugged me at the door, perfume thick and floral. "You're such a dear," she said. "Family dinners should always feel this warm." "Indeed," I answered. "Warmth reveals everything." Outside, the night air was crisp, the harbor glittering under a sliver of moon. I walked slowly to my car, heels clicking softly against the driveway stones. Behind me, their laughter resumed, muffled through walls that echoed more pride than peace. I paused before opening the door, glancing back once. Their windows glowed gold against the dark, fragile as lanterns in a storm. Some lights burn bright for show, others steady for truth. I knew then that my silence at that table wasn't surrender. It was a seed, one that would grow, quietly, into something undeniable. The next morning, the sea was restless, tossing white foam across the rocks as if mirroring the stirring in my chest. I stood on the porch with a cup of chamomile, breathing in the sharp scent of salt and pine. For weeks, I had folded every insult into patience, every slight into silence. But silence, I'd learned, could plant things too, roots of strength, threads of intention. It was time to tend them. On the table beside me lay two familiar objects, the silver frame and the letter sealed in burgundy wax. I brushed my fingers across the frame first, reading the words I had engraved years ago. Forever begins humbly. They no longer felt like a benediction. They felt like instruction. Then my gaze shifted to the letter. I hadn't opened it in 7 years, not since Thomas had pressed it into my palm before his surgery. His handwriting on the envelope had softened with time. The ink feathered slightly along the edges. I lifted it, feeling its weight, its quiet demand. "Not yet," I whispered. "Soon." Inside, my phone buzzed. A reminder blinked across the screen. Resort maintenance review. Patricia Ross. Patricia had managed my properties since Thomas passed, a meticulous woman who treated every ledger like scripture. I hesitated for a moment, then tapped her number. She answered on the second ring. "Good morning, Mrs. Cole." "Patricia," I said, my voice steady. "I need updated valuations on the full portfolio, properties, accounts, everything." "Of course," she replied. "Is there a particular reason?" I looked out at the horizon, where a gull hovered against the wind before banking back toward shore. "Clarity," I said simply. "And confirmation. I'd like each statement verified and ready for disclosure, should it be required." There was a pause. Patricia had worked with me long enough to read between the lines. "I'll have the summaries prepared within 48 hours. And the resort, do you want the monthly report included?" "Yes," I said. "Especially Seabrook. Make sure it notes the ownership structure and current income." "Understood." When I hung up, I felt a calm I hadn't known in days. Plans don't always need anger. Sometimes they just need precision. I brought the frame and letter inside, placing them on my desk beside my planner. Opening it, I flipped past grocery lists and community meeting notes until I found the page I'd written on earlier that week. "Reclaim what's yours." Not in anger, but in truth. Beneath it, I drew a single line and added, "Grace isn't weakness, it's preparation." By noon, I drove into town. The streets were quiet, lined with shop windows displaying shells and postcards for tourists who hadn't yet arrived. At the end of Main Street, a small bakery glowed with warm light. Inside, Evelyn sat at her usual table, her cane resting beside her chair, a crossword open in front of her. "You look resolved," she said as I slid into the seat opposite her. "Maybe I am," I replied. "I've decided to stop letting people write my story for me." Evelyn smiled, folding her paper. "About time. What changed?" "I suppose grace has its limits," I said, stirring my tea. "Not in kindness, but in silence. Sometimes silence must shift into action." She nodded slowly. "And what form will action take?" "Preparation," I said. "Records, witnesses, evidence. Not for vengeance, but for understanding. They need to see the truth, not hear it." Evelyn chuckled softly. "You're building a case for grace." "Something like that." We talked for a while, about gardens and gulls, the way storms test roots. Before leaving, she placed her hand over mine. "Remember, Marjorie, truth matures in silence, but blooms when watered by courage." Outside, the clouds had parted, and sunlight spilled across the street. I walked toward my car, the wind tugging at my scarf, carrying with it the faint scent of seaweed and spring. On the way home, I stopped by the bank. The teller greeted me with a smile, and I withdrew $8,000 in crisp bills. When she asked if I wanted a cashier's check, I shook my head. "No, thank you," I said. "Cash is fine." At home, I placed the money in a small ivory envelope and wrote across the front, "Gift of Grace Fund." It wasn't about the sum, it was about symbolism. A seed planted not for applause, but for redemption. As evening settled, I walked the perimeter of my garden, the wind soft now, the light gold and forgiving. The anemones near the gate trembled gently, their petals closing as dusk approached. I knelt to brush a fallen leaf from their stems. They had weathered last week's storm, bending but never breaking. Inside, I poured a cup of tea and stood by the window. The horizon was painted in shades of lavender and coral, the sea breathing in and out like an old friend. Somewhere within that rhythm, a decision took root, deep and sure. I would not correct them with words. I would let the truth arrive dressed in its own dignity, public, undeniable, patient as the tide. And when it did, I wanted it to find me ready. The rehearsal dinner was held in the resort's smaller banquet room, a space lined with arched windows and soft ivory drapes that swayed with the ocean breeze. I arrived early, carrying a tray of small favors I'd wrapped myself, handmade candles scented with sea salt and lilac. The staff greeted me warmly, though I could see in their eyes the same polite sympathy that had begun to follow me everywhere. The hashtags and whispers had done their work. Guests trickled in, all silk dresses and polished smiles. Laughter floated like perfume, sweet but shallow. At the head table, Laurel and John beamed, their matching navy ensembles glittering under the chandeliers. Sienna shimmered beside them, her gown catching every flicker of light, Nathan close at her side, his hand resting lightly on hers. "Mrs. Cole," Laurel called, waving me over. "You're just in time. We're doing a little toast to celebrate this wonderful family." Wonderful. The word had begun to sound like a veil. I set the tray on a side table and took my place among the guests. Glasses clinked as Laurel stood, her pearls gleaming. "To generosity," she began, raising her champagne, "and to Marjorie, whose incredible sacrifice and humble heart made all of this possible." A polite murmur of agreement rippled through the room. My name, dressed in charity, felt heavy in my chest. Laurel continued, "It's rare these days to see such selflessness, working so hard, saving so carefully. It's inspiring, truly. You remind us all that love doesn't need luxury to be meaningful." Applause followed, gentle, well-meaning, drenched in condescension. I smiled, nodding once. "Thank you," I said simply, my voice even. Sometimes the smallest words carry the deepest roots. But Sienna wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her tone airy, cheerful. "It's true. You've shown us that love is about heart, not extravagance. I mean, who needs designer gifts when you have coupons, right?" A ripple of laughter swept across the tables. Nathan's hand tightened on his glass. His jaw twitched, but he said nothing. My heart fluttered once, hurt, restrained, brief. Then I folded my napkin across my lap, pressing its edge with calm precision. "I've always believed gratitude is its own reward," I said softly. "And generosity, well, it wears many faces." Laurel nodded quickly, eager to redirect. Of course. Now let's raise our glasses." Before she could continue, a young server approached with a tray of sparkling cider. She paused beside me, eyes widening. "Mrs. Cole?" I turned, studying her face. She couldn't have been more than 22, with earnest eyes and a nervous smile. "Yes?" "It's me, Grace Allen," she said quietly. from Brookhaven Elementary. You taught my third-grade class." Recognition bloomed like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Grace," I said, smiling fully for the first time that evening, "you're all grown up." She nodded, her voice trembling. "I never forgot you. You bought me my first textbook when my mom couldn't afford it. You told me I'd build something beautiful one day." Her words landed gently, stitching warmth where pity had tried to tear. Around us, conversations softened, curiosity flickering like candlelight. "I'm glad you did," I said. "You've built yourself, haven't you?" "Yes, ma'am," she whispered. "I'm finishing college now, working here part-time. You taught me what worth means." I felt a sting behind my eyes, not of sadness, but recognition. The seeds we plant in kindness bloom quietly, often when we've stopped, watching. "Thank you, Grace," I said, touching her hand. "You were always meant to bloom." As she moved on, the room seemed to breathe differently. The laughter dimmed, the tone shifted. Even Laurel blinked, uncertain. Sienna fiddled with her glass, eyes darting toward me, then away. Nathan leaned closer. "You okay, Mom?" I nodded. "Better than they know." Dinner continued, softer now, threads of sincerity weaving through the polite chatter. I caught glimpses of Grace moving between tables, her posture proud, her steps sure. Each time our eyes met, I felt Thomas's words echo once more. True worth never needs to shout. When the plates were cleared and the candles burned low, I rose quietly, slipping a small ivory envelope from my bag. I placed it in my planner beside the silver frame. The Gift of Grace Fund, $8,000 set aside not for penance, but for purpose. As guests gathered their coats, Laurel approached me, her tone sweet but strained. "You really have a gift, Marjorie. People remember you." I smiled gently. That's the point of a gift, isn't it? To last. Outside, the night was soft, the surf murmuring against the shore. I walked slowly toward my car, heels pressing faint impressions into the sand-streaked path. The moon hung low, a silver coin in the sky. Behind me, laughter resumed inside the hall. Faint, distant, fading. Ahead, the sea stretched wide and calm, a mirror of patience and promise. Every kindness sown in silence would return, in its own time, in its own way. And when it did, I would be there to meet it, steady, grateful, ready. The wedding day dawned clear and blue, the kind of morning that looks like forgiveness. The air smelled of salt and lilac, and sunlight spilled across the resort's stone steps as guests arrived in clusters of silk and cologne. From the balcony of my suite, I watched them filter toward the grand lawn, their laughter mingling with the distant hush of waves. Everything shimmered: the water, the white chairs, the string quartet tuning softly in the breeze. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my pale gray dress. It wasn't new, but it was elegant in the quiet way I'd learned to trust. In my hands, wrapped in cream paper and tied with silver ribbon, rested the gift. The same silver frame Thomas had chosen for our wedding day. He'd had it engraved the night before we said our vows. Forever begins humbly. A truth we lived by, one slow, steady year at a time. Downstairs, the ceremony unfolded like clockwork. Vows, applause, the flutter of flower petals. Sienna glowed, radiant and composed, her gown sweeping across the aisle like a wave. Nathan's eyes found mine only once, as if seeking steady ground. I gave him the smallest nod. Love, after all, is a bridge we build even when we're the only one holding the hammer. After the ceremony, guests were ushered into the ballroom, now draped in white roses and pale gold. Waiters floated through with trays of champagne. The chatter was bright, expectant. A long table at the front gleamed beneath the chandeliers, stacked with ornate boxes, ribbons curling like silk vines. Sienna moved between guests with practiced ease, her smile sharp as crystal. "Time for gifts," someone called, and the crowd gathered close. Cameras rose, laughter sparkled. When my turn came, I stepped forward, the small box balanced in both hands. "For you," I said softly. She unwrapped it quickly, ribbons falling away, paper whispering open. The silver caught the light, and for a moment, just one, her expression softened. Then came the pause, the tilt of her head, the curl of her lip. "Is this," she began, turning the frame in her fingers, "antique junk?" The laughter started small, nervous chuckles, polite giggles, but it grew, rippling outward like a tide. Someone coughed to hide a smile. Another sipped champagne to cover discomfort. The quartet faltered, a single note hanging in the air before fading. Nathan froze beside her, his hand still half raised from clapping. His eyes darted from her face to mine, searching for rescue he couldn't offer. I stood very still, the room blurred slightly, like a watercolor washed by rain. My heart thudded once, hard and low, but my hands did not shake. Instead, I pressed the ribbon into my palm, let the edge bite faintly into my skin, and smiled, a soft, practiced smile that had weathered decades of dismissal. "I thought you might like something lasting," I said. "Oh, it's sweet," she replied, setting it aside, her voice sing-song. "Very sentimental." The word landed like dust. I felt eyes on me, rows of strangers cloaked in pity, whispers blooming at the edges of the room. Somewhere near the back, a guest murmured, "Bless her heart." Another sighed, "Teachers are so thoughtful." A waiter brushed past, nearly bumping my shoulder. The silver frame glinted on the table, forgotten already among towers of gloss and gold. Inside my clutch, my fingers brushed against the sealed letter, edges worn from years of waiting. I held it for a moment, grounding myself in its weight. I hadn't opened it yet, not because I feared what it said, but because I knew the right moment would reveal itself. Maybe it wasn't far now. The band began a new song, something light and careless. Laughter swelled again. Sienna leaned into Laurel's shoulder, whispering something that made them both smile. I heard the words, "humble gift," and for a heartbeat, the world tilted. Humility is quiet, but humiliation echoes. I turned slightly, catching sight of Grace among the servers, her eyes wide with understanding. She didn't look away. She simply nodded once, small, sure, like an anchor in a storm. I exhaled, slow and steady. Sometimes grace isn't softness. It's steel wrapped in calm. I glanced at Nathan. He stood still, lips pressed tight, shame flickering across his face. I wanted to reach out, to tell him he didn't have to fix this moment. That truth has its own clock. Instead, I lifted my glass in a small toast only he could see. A mother's signal. Patience. When the applause faded, I slipped quietly toward the balcony doors. The night air greeted me with open arms, cool, clean, and honest. Below, the sea stretched out, dark and endless, its rhythm unchanged by any laughter. From inside, the music swelled again. Behind me, I heard Sienna's voice ring out, bright and brittle. "To family, to blessings." The guests cheered. I looked up at the stars and whispered to the wind, "Blessings indeed." The frame, the laughter, the whispers, they would all fade. But truth would rise, as sure as the tide. And when it did, it would arrive not in anger, but in grace. The morning after the wedding, the resort was hushed, as if the building itself were catching its breath. The ballroom was empty now, the air still scented with roses and champagne. though the laughter that had filled it only hours ago had long since dissolved into silence. I walked through the space slowly, fingertips brushing across the linen-draped tables, pausing where the silver frame had rested. It was gone now, packed away with the other gifts, forgotten among ribbons and crystal. But I remembered where it had stood, center table, spotlighted by cruelty. Through the tall glass windows, the ocean shimmered. The tide was high, restless. I stood there a moment, breathing deeply, letting the salt steady me. The hurt from the night before still sat in my chest, but it had hardened into something clear, something quiet. Thomas used to say that truth was like a current. You can't stop it, only steer it. It was time to steer. In my office upstairs, sunlight spilled across the desk, catching the edges of neatly stacked folders. Patricia Ross's documents lay open, fresh from her courier, updated valuations, signed and sealed. The numbers were exact, the records indisputable. 12 rental properties, 3 vacation holdings, a managed portfolio yielding a steady income, and 1 oceanfront resort, this very one, registered entirely in my name. Beside the paperwork sat my planner, open to a single line I'd written days ago. Reclaim what's yours, not in anger, but in truth. I reached for the phone. Patricia answered on the first ring, brisk and professional as always. "Good morning, Mrs. Cole. I was just about to call. Everything's been verified." "Thank you," I said. "I'll need you on standby tonight." A brief pause. "On standby?" "Yes," I said. "There's a celebration dinner at the ballroom, an official farewell before the honeymoon. I'd like you to be available by phone, on speaker." "May I ask what for?" "For clarity," I replied. "The kind that ends whispers." Patricia hesitated, then her voice softened. "Understood. I'll prepare the summary myself." "And Patricia," I added, "make sure the Seabrook ownership is listed first. Include monthly revenue, and note that all maintenance approvals require the owner's consent." "I will. Shall I have the documents ready in case they're requested?" "They'll be requested," I said quietly, "in one way or another." After we hung up, I sent a short message to Clara, the wedding planner. She had seen enough of the week's small humiliations to understand without question. "Clara, could you ensure the sound system is available during dinner? I may need to take a call on speaker. Just a simple setup." Her reply came almost instantly. "Of course, Mrs. Cole. I'll handle it personally." I smiled faintly, gratitude and resolve mingling in my chest. Every act of kindness leaves a witness, every truth, a path. Outside, gulls wheeled above the surf, their cries sharp against the wind. I stepped onto the balcony, letting the breeze thread through my hair. The sea stretched out before me, vast, patient, certain. Somewhere in its rhythm, I found my own. I thought of the laughter echoing through that room, of Sienna's voice slicing the air with careless superiority. I thought of the pitying glances, the murmured "bless her heart," all of it small, fleeting. The truth, when it came, would not shout. It would arrive like the tide, inevitable, unstoppable, cleansing. I turned back inside and reached for the silver frame, which I'd retrieved that morning from the gift table. It rested now on the edge of the desk, its surface polished, its message unbroken. "Forever begins humbly." I traced the words with my fingertip, the metal cool beneath my skin. "Thomas," I whispered, "if you were here, you'd remind me to let Grace do the talking." And that was exactly what I intended to do. The clock on the wall ticked softly, counting down the hours. There would be no confrontation, no raised voices, only a call, a simple call, set on speaker, carrying facts that spoke for themselves. Before leaving the office, I placed the silver frame into my bag and slipped the wax-sealed letter beside it. Its time was drawing near. I could feel it in the air, in the steadiness of my pulse. Downstairs, staff bustled, preparing the final dinner. Laurel's voice carried faintly from the terrace, issuing orders about centerpieces and seating charts. I passed unnoticed, a quiet figure in their periphery, content to let them underestimate me one last time. At the doorway, Clara caught my eye. "Everything's ready," she said softly. "When you need it, just signal." "Thank you," I replied. "Sometimes a single call changes the room." She smiled. "Sometimes silence does too." As evening descended, the sky blushed gold over the water. The tables glimmered under candlelight, the same chandeliers reflecting in each glass. Guests would gather soon, glasses would clink, and Sienna would speak. Of sacrifice, of modesty, of pity wrapped in praise. And when she did, I would let her. Because this time, truth would not wait in silence. It would arrive, steady as the tide, and the room would listen. By twilight, the ballroom had been reset once more. Candles flickering, music low, the scent of roses heavy in the air. The farewell dinner was smaller than the wedding, but no less ornate. The tables shimmered beneath the chandeliers, glasses lined like crystal soldiers, laughter already humming through the room. I arrived quietly, taking a seat near the end of the table, the same modest corner I'd chosen before. The silver frame rested in my bag, beside the sealed letter and the planner that now held Patricia's confirmed valuations. Everything I needed waited in silence, as calm and certain as the tide beyond the windows. Nathan waved when he saw me, relief flashing across his face. He came to greet me, helping me with my chair, his voice soft. "You didn't have to come, Mom. I know last night." "I wanted to," I said. "There's always value in showing up." He gave a small nod, understanding more than he could say, then returned to his seat beside Sienna. She was radiant again tonight, glowing in ivory silk, her laughter carrying easily through the room. Laurel and John hovered close, their charm deliberate, their smiles rehearsed. Dinner unfolded in courses, soups, salads, entrees adorned with truffle and gold leaf. Every detail sparkled, every bite whispered luxury. I ate quietly, tasting none of it, my mind steady, anchored on what was coming. When dessert plates were cleared and the wine glasses refilled, Laurel rose, tapping her spoon lightly against the crystal. The sound drew a hush, the kind reserved for ceremony. "Before we say farewell to these newlyweds," she began, "we'd like to offer a toast. To family, to love, and to those whose sacrifices make moments like this possible." Eyes turned toward me before she even gestured. "Laurel," Sienna said brightly, "may I?" Her mother nodded with pride. Sienna stood, her silk gown rippling softly as she lifted her glass. "Tonight," she said, voice warm, polished, "we want to honor someone very special, Nathan's mother, Marjorie." Polite applause rippled around the room. I smiled faintly, folding my hands in my lap. "She has shown us," Sienna continued, "that love doesn't need extravagance to be beautiful. That generosity can come from the simplest places. Her humility, her devotion, her willingness to give all she has, even from a modest life, has inspired us deeply." The word modest rang through the hall, soft as silk, sharp as glass. Around me, guests nodded, eyes tender with pity. Some clapped, others murmured, "How lovely." "She taught us," Sienna went on, "that you don't need much to make dreams come true. Sometimes, a humble heart gives the richest gift." Nathan shifted beside her, unease flickering across his face. His hand twitched against his napkin. I saw his throat work, but he said nothing. My heart beat steady, calm. Every syllable of her speech, so sweet, so gilded in condescension, fell exactly where it needed to. When she finished, applause swelled again, louder this time. Glasses raised, smiles beamed. I rose slowly, each movement deliberate, the hush returning before I even spoke. "Thank you," I said, voice even. "Your kindness means more than you know." I glanced toward the back of the room, where Clara stood near the sound system, waiting. She caught my eye, hand poised near the switch. I gave her a small nod. "I'd like to share something as well," I continued. Not a speech, just a moment of clarity. Sometimes, when words travel too far from truth, the truth finds its own way home. A murmur swept through the crowd, curious, uncertain. Sienna tilted her head, smile fixed, the faintest tremor behind it. I lifted my phone, pressed the screen once. "Patricia," I said softly, "are you there?" Her voice filled the room, clear, measured, echoing through every speaker. "Yes, Mrs. Cole. Good evening, everyone." Every head turned toward the sound. Forks stilled. Glasses froze midair. Sienna blinked, confused. "Patricia?" "My property manager," I said gently. "She handles my portfolio." The room grew quiet, curiosity thick, expectant. Patricia's tone remained professional, steady. "Per your request, Mrs. Cole, I have the latest valuation summary ready. Would you like me to proceed?" "Yes, please," I replied. Sienna's eyes darted to Nathan. "What's this about?" she whispered, voice thinning. He shook his head slightly. "Just listen." Patricia cleared her throat. "As of this quarter, the Cole estate includes 12 rental properties across Brookhaven, 3 vacation holdings, a managed investment portfolio, and full ownership of Seabrook Oceanfront Resort, valued at approximately $3.8 million, yielding a net monthly income of $26,000. The room went still, utterly still. Glasses hovered, breaths held. The air shifted, heavy, electric. Sienna's hand fell to the table. "The resort?" she echoed. "Yes," I said softly, meeting her eyes. "The one you chose, the one you've adored since you were a child. Consider it part of my humble contribution." She stared at me, lips parted, the color draining from her face. "That's our honeymoon suite." "Then it's only fitting," I replied gently. "After all, every beginning deserves blessing." Silence stretched, deep and absolute. Then, from the corner of the room, a voice broke softly through. "She taught me what worth means." Grace stood near the doorway, her tray balanced against her hip, eyes bright, steady. A ripple moved through the guests. Recognition, realization, something shifting. Applause began, tentative, then growing, rolling through the room like a wave. Nathan rose to his feet, his face pale with shock and pride all at once. Sienna sank slowly back into her chair, her hand trembling around her glass. The truth had arrived, calm, factual, irrefutable, and the room at last listened. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The chandeliers above seemed to hold their breath, and even the sea outside the tall windows stilled against the glass. Every sound in the room, the clink of silverware, the shuffle of linen, the hum of air conditioning, vanished into a stunned hush. 180 guests sat frozen in disbelief, their gazes swinging between me and the speakers, where Patricia's voice hung steady and clear. Patricia continued, her tone warm but firm, each word falling like a peebled truth into still water. Seabrook Oceanfront Resort remains fully owned and operated under the Cole Family Trust. Monthly net income averages $26,000, with occupancy near capacity year-round. In addition, all premium suite upgrades require owner's authorization. Her professionalism wrapped the numbers in grace, but their weight was unmistakable. Sienna's hand trembled against her napkin. "That can't be right," she whispered, her voice small, stripped of its usual sheen. I've seen the brochures, the partners, It's right," Nathan said quietly, eyes fixed on me. "It's hers." I inclined my head. "Ours, technically. Thomas and I built it together." Laurel's face paled, her pearls shifting against her collar as she turned to her husband. John coughed into his fist, mumbling something about having heard the name before. Around them, polite guests fumbled for composure, their smiles wavering, their pity curdling into awe. Sienna blinked rapidly, her voice shaking. You let me plan our wedding here." "I did," I said. "You loved it, and love should never feel forbidden." She swallowed hard, her earlier laughter now a ghost between us. "But the gift?" I reached into my bag and drew out the silver frame, holding it up so the lights caught its engraving. "This," I said softly, "was our first wedding gift, from my husband to me. We couldn't afford much then, only meaning. Forever begins humbly. He believed what starts in humility can only grow in strength." The words floated through the room, quiet but resonant. I set the frame gently on the table before her. "You laughed because you thought it was all I had. But everything you celebrated tonight, the resort, the view, the very floor beneath your feet, came from the same hands that gave you this frame." The room absorbed the revelation, layer by layer, like dawn unfolding. No one spoke. Patricia cleared her throat again, concluding the report. "All records remain transparent and up to date. I'll send full documentation to your office, Mrs. Cole, as usual. Congratulations." "Thank you, Patricia," I said. "You've done enough." She paused. "One last note, Mrs. Cole. There's a charitable ledger listed under something called the Gift of Grace Fund." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I nodded. "Yes, it's set aside for scholarships and small business grants. 8,000 to start. Consider it my wedding gift." Across the room, Grace stepped forward, setting her tray on a nearby table. "She helped me once," she said, voice trembling but sure. "When I couldn't afford a textbook, she bought it for me. That's how I got to college. That's why I'm here tonight." Someone clapped softly, uncertain, then another, and another, until the applause grew, echoing off the high ceilings, swelling into something whole. Sienna rose halfway, tears catching on her lashes. "Mrs. Cole, I lifted a hand, gentle, steady. "It's all right. We all learn at our own pace. Some lessons simply cost more." She nodded, her lips pressed tight, shame and gratitude mingling in her eyes. Nathan stood now too, his expression open, humbled, full of a love that carried both apology and pride. The applause faded into reverent silence. For the first time all evening, no one whispered, no one explained. Truth had filled the room, and it needed no translation. I looked out across the tables, at faces now softened by understanding. The pity had dissolved, leaving only respect, the kind that cannot be faked or forced. It was quiet, but it was complete. The band, unsure, plucked at a tentative note. I smiled at them. "Play something gentle," I said, "something the sea would recognize." A slow melody rose, tender and clear, wrapping the hall in calm. I lifted my glass, not high, just enough. "To beginnings," I said, "the humble kind." Guests followed, glasses raised, voices murmuring agreement. As I sat, the silver frame gleamed before me, the candlelight dancing across its surface. Sienna wiped her eyes, Nathan reached for her hand, and Grace stood at the edge of the room, smiling softly, her tray forgotten. For the first time that week, the air felt light again, cleansed, truthful. I rested my palm over the planner in my lap, where the sealed letter waited, Soon, I thought. Soon I would open it. But not yet. Tonight was not for closure. Tonight was for clarity, and in that clarity, I found peace. When the music faded and the guests began to drift toward the exits, I slipped quietly from the ballroom to the terrace. The air outside was cool, threaded with the scent of salt and roses. Lanterns flickered along the stone railing, their light bending gently against the wind. Below, the sea murmured, calm now, as if satisfied that the truth had finally found its voice. I rested my hands on the railing, feeling the chill of the metal seep into my palms. For a long moment, I simply breathed, steady, slow, letting the tide match my heartbeat. Behind me, laughter softened into murmurs, then footsteps, then quiet. The night exhaled. I heard Nathan before I saw him. The door closed softly, and then he was there beside me, his face caught in half-light, eyes searching mine. "Mom," he said, voice low, almost breaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" I kept my gaze on the horizon. "Because you didn't need to know to love me." He shook his head. "That's not fair. You shouldn't have stood there while everyone laughed. I should have spoken up." I turned toward him, gentle but firm. "Defended me?" "Nathan, people don't learn from being corrected. They learn from seeing what they missed." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's that my chest ached. "I feel like I failed you." "You didn't," I said softly. "You were kind. You were patient. You stayed. That's more than most do when truth is buried under assumption." His eyes glistened. I can't believe she said those things in front of everyone. About your gift. About your life." I smiled faintly. "The world measures worth in volume, Nathan. The louder, the greater. But your father and I built quietly. Every brick, every sacrifice. It wasn't for show. It was for roots. You were our harvest." He swallowed hard, blinking away tears. "Dad would have been proud of you tonight." "Pride wasn't what he wanted," I said. "He wanted understanding. And you found it." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The waves lapped against the rocks below, steady, endless. Then Nathan exhaled, a long sigh, like something heavy leaving him. "I remember," he murmured, "the day of his surgery. It was raining. You stood at the hospital window, watching the parking lot, and I asked if you were scared." I smiled. "And what did I say?" "You said, 'Courage isn't loud, it's steady.'" He laughed softly, a sound laced with tears. "I didn't get it then." "You do now." He nodded. "I do." We stood there together, mother and son, the silence between us no longer filled with guilt, but with grace. After a moment, Nathan spoke again, voice quieter now. "What will you do with them? Sienna, her parents, after this?" "What's there to do?" I asked, turning back to the water. "Truth doesn't punish. It teaches. They'll have to live with what they've learned." He nodded slowly. She looked broken. "Sometimes we have to break before we open," I said. "If she's willing, humility can grow where pride once stood." He leaned against the railing beside me. "I'll talk to her. She's not cruel, Mom. Just afraid. Afraid of being less." "I know," I said softly. "Fear dresses itself in arrogance sometimes. But fear isn't permanent. Grace is." He looked at me then, eyes full of a love I hadn't seen since he was a boy clutching my hand at the school gate. "I'm sorry, Mom, for not seeing you sooner." I reached for his hand, threading my fingers through his. "Seeing takes time. Don't apologize for what time fixes." He squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back, our silence now an embrace. Inside, the band began to pack their instruments. The faint scrape of chairs echoed through the hall. I could see Sienna through the window, sitting alone at the table, the silver frame before her. She ran her thumb across the engraving, her face soft, unsure. "She'll come around," Nathan said quietly. "I know," I replied. "Truth lingers. It doesn't demand." He straightened, inhaled deeply. "Do you need help gathering your things?" "No," I said, smiling. "Everything I needed tonight already happened." He leaned in, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "I love you." "I know," I whispered. "Now go to her. She'll need your calm." He nodded once more, then turned back toward the ballroom, leaving me on the terrace bathed in moonlight. I watched him go, his silhouette framed by the golden doorway, the sound of the sea folding around me like a promise. Above, the stars shimmered, quiet witnesses to a truth reclaimed. For the first time in days, I felt the ache in my chest ease. Humiliation had passed, dignity had bloomed, and love, tested, tempered, had found its way home. The next morning dawned gray and wind-streaked, clouds draped low over the horizon. I woke early, brewed tea, and stood at the window watching the waves batter the shore. Restless, cleansing. The ballroom had emptied hours ago, but traces of the evening remained. Folded programs, wilted flowers, footprints on marble. Truth lingers longer than celebration. I was halfway through my second cup when a soft knock echoed at the door. It wasn't housekeeping. The rhythm was too tentative, too human. I opened it to find Sienna standing there, hair pulled into a loose knot, makeup washed away, her face bare and pale. She held the silver frame against her chest like a fragile truth. "Mrs. Cole," she began, voice unsteady, "do you have a moment?" I stepped aside. "Of course." She entered slowly, eyes darting around the room as if searching for somewhere to hide her shame. Finally, she settled into the chair by the window, clutching the frame, staring at the words engraved along its border. "Forever begins humbly." "I couldn't sleep," she said after a moment. "I kept hearing your voice. The way you said, 'What starts in humility can only grow in strength.' I thought about that all night." I sat across from her, folding my hands in my lap. Sometimes truth keeps us awake until we understand it. She nodded, eyes glistening. "I don't know why I did it. The jokes, the tone. I wanted so badly to look like I belonged. My parents raised me to believe appearance was everything. How you dress, who you sit beside, where you host your wedding. I thought if I looked the part, I'd never feel small." Her voice cracked. But I felt small anyway. Standing there last night, hearing Patricia's voice, realizing I'd spent weeks judging the woman who built the very floor beneath me. I felt like I'd been holding a mirror I refused to look into. I let her speak. "Some lessons need their own breath." "I was terrified," she continued. "When I found out my parents lost everything, I swore I'd never be that vulnerable again. I built this armor out of taste and polish, but underneath, I was just scared. And when I looked at you, so calm, so steady, I thought if I could make you seem less, I'd feel more." Her confession trembled through the room like wind across glass. I leaned forward slightly. "Fear often wears arrogance to survive, but it can't grow beneath it." Tears slid down her cheeks. "I don't deserve your kindness." "Kindness isn't a reward," I said softly. "It's a responsibility. We're all caretakers of grace, especially when others stumble." She drew a shaky breath. "Can you forgive me?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "But forgiveness isn't erasure. It's work. You'll have to rebuild what was cracked, not with gifts or apologies, but with time." She nodded, gripping the frame tighter. "Tell me how. I'll do anything." "Start by learning the difference between wealth and worth," I said. "One fills rooms, the other fills hearts. And when you build, build quietly. Let results speak, not reputation. She glanced down at the engraving again. I used to think humility was weakness. It's the opposite, I replied. Humility lets you stand where pride would make you fall. Sienna wiped her eyes, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. Nathan told me about his childhood last night. How you worked nights, saved every penny. How you and Mr. Cole painted the first duplex yourselves. I never knew. He said you wanted to teach him value, not vanity. I smiled gently. We wanted him to know the difference between building a life and decorating one. She exhaled, shoulders slumping. I want to learn that too. You will, I said. But remember, change isn't performance. It's practice. Sienna rose slowly, setting the frame on the table between us. I'll keep this where I can see it, she whispered. Not to remind me of my mistake, but of your mercy. I stood, placing a hand on her shoulder. Mercy isn't mine. It's something we pass along when we find it. Her eyes met mine, red but resolute. Thank you, she said, for letting me be wrong and for showing me how to make it right. We walked to the door together. She paused before stepping into the hall, turning back once more. You'll be proud of me one day, she said softly. I already am, I replied, not for what you've done, but for what you're willing to learn. When she was gone, I sat again by the window, watching the waves roll against the shore. The clouds were breaking now, streaks of light threading through gray. The world looked washed clean. On the table, the silver frame gleamed beside my tea, its inscription catching the first hint of sun. Forever begins humbly. In humility, she had found the doorway to grace, and in forgiving her, I had found my own peace. The day after the storm of revelations, the sun returned as if nothing had happened. Soft light draping the shore, the ocean calm again, steady in its rhythm. I arrived early at Seabrook, the resort now humming with quiet industry. Staff moved like sunlight across marble floors, arranging flowers, polishing railings, folding linen into perfect symmetry. It was the same place, yet something in its air had changed. Lighter, freer, as though truth had swept through and left clarity in its wake. At the entrance, Clara greeted me with her usual calm. Mrs. Cole, she said, everything's ready for the honeymoon suite. Would you like to take one last walk before they arrive? Yes, I smiled. I'd like that. We strolled through the grand corridor, where sunlight pooled across tiled mosaics and waves whispered beyond the glass. Every painting, every vase, every bloom felt like a memory reclaimed. When we reached the atrium, Clara paused, gesturing toward the reception wall. There, above the mantel, hung the silver frame. It caught the morning light, gleaming against the soft creamstone. Inside it, I'd placed a photograph from my wedding day. Thomas in his navy suit, smiling at me beneath a garland of wildflowers. Beneath the frame, a small brass plaque read, "Forever begins humbly." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My breath caught, tender and full. Clara must have sensed it. She stepped back, letting silence do the work. Guests passed through the lobby, pausing to admire the engraving, unaware of its story, yet drawn to its stillness. That was the beauty of quiet symbols. They didn't need explanation. They simply stood, dignified, patient, true. As I turned to leave, a voice called from behind. Mrs. Cole? Grace hurried across the marble, her server's apron tucked neatly around her waist. I wanted to thank you, she said, cheeks flushed with sincerity. Not just for what you did last night, but for everything before. You taught me how to see kindness as strength. I smiled. You reminded me that seeds sown in kindness don't vanish. They wait. She nodded. You'll always have a student here. I'll always have hope, I said. When she returned to her post, I lingered one last moment in front of the frame. In its reflection, I saw not the widow who'd been pitied, but the woman who'd built quietly, endured gracefully, and reclaimed truth without raising her voice. Outside, the air was fragrant with jasmine and salt. I walked toward the private path leading to the oceanfront suites. The sea glittered through the palms, 1,000 shifting diamonds in the morning light. Staff had prepared everything: fresh flowers, chilled champagne, curtains drawn to frame the view. A sign beside the suite door read, "Welcome home, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore." The words, simple as they were, held more meaning now. Welcome home, not just to walls and ceilings, but to humility, to understanding, to love renewed by truth. Nathan and Sienna would arrive soon. They would cross the threshold not as a couple performing wealth, but as two people beginning anew, aware, grounded, changed. I stood on the veranda overlooking the sea. The breeze lifted my hair, and the sunlight warmed the silver ring Thomas had once slipped on my finger. In its glint, I saw him again, steady, smiling, the man who'd believed that quiet work would one day speak louder than pride. You were right, I whispered into the wind. Grace is the loudest answer. Down below, a wave curled toward shore, foaming white, breaking gently against the sand before retreating. Forward, back, forward again. A rhythm older than any wound. Behind me, the resort bell chimed softly. Somewhere near the entrance, Nathan's voice called to the valet, followed by Sienna's laughter, no longer brittle, but tender, nervous, alive. I turned once to look. She held his hand, her posture humble, her eyes scanning the hall until they met mine. When they did, she smiled. Not a polished smile, but a true one. I nodded in return, letting the moment pass like a blessing. As they disappeared into the suite, I took one last look at the horizon. The sea stretched wide, endless, honest. I whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude for storms weathered, for lessons learned, for beginnings that rise from humility. Then I turned toward the exit, heels clicking softly against the stone. Each step felt lighter, as though the weight of judgment and silence had finally lifted, replaced by something far gentler. Peace. The world outside shone bright, and for the first time in a long while, I walked without looking back. 3 months later, autumn had come softly to Brookhaven. The air turned crisp, the mornings draped in mist, and the shoreline shimmered in pale gold. The summer crowds had long departed, leaving the town to its own gentle rhythm. Seagulls calling across quiet docks, wind chimes sighing against porch rails, waves whispering their familiar hymns. Life had settled into a calm I hadn't known in years. Each day began with tea on the porch and ended with a walk along the beach, the tide marking time more faithfully than any clock. Peace has a texture. You can feel it in your bones when truth has finally taken its seat. Inside my kitchen, a pot of stew simmered, filling the house with rosemary and memory. At the dining table, 3 plates waited. One for me, one for Nathan, one for Sienna. They arrived together now, often on Sundays, carrying stories instead of judgments, laughter instead of tension. When they walked in that evening, the house warmed instantly. Nathan carried a bottle of cider. Sienna held a notebook pressed to her chest. She had enrolled in a local finance course, studying real estate and small business investments. "I'm learning," she'd told me last month. "Not just how money moves, but how meaning does." They helped set the table, moving easily around the kitchen, no longer tiptoeing through unspoken boundaries. Grace can turn a house into a home faster than any apology. Dinner passed in gentle rhythm. Stories of their new home, Sienna's first mentorship meeting, Nathan's latest project restoring the local dunes. Between courses, they asked questions, listened, and shared plans with humility, each idea anchored in gratitude. After dessert, as twilight deepened, I reached for the drawer by the window. Inside, wrapped in faded lace, rested the letter Thomas had sealed 7 years ago. The wax was still intact, burgundy against cream, the edges worn soft from my hands. "I think it's time," I whispered. Nathan nodded, and Sienna's eyes glistened. With careful fingers, I broke the seal. The paper unfolded with a faint crackle, the handwriting instantly familiar, strong, deliberate, full of love. "My Marjorie," it began. "If you're reading this, it means life has asked you to walk a while without me. I know you'll meet the world with grace. That's how you've met everything. But I also know kindness can make you quiet when truth deserves a voice. So promise me this. When life humbles you, wear it like grace. Never mistake gentleness for weakness or silence for surrender. The world may not see your strength, but I always did. Love builds quiet empires, Marjorie, and you—" The ink faded there, but the message had already settled into me, deep and sure. I folded the letter slowly, pressing it to my heart. "He always knew what I'd need," I said. Nathan reached for my hand. "He still does." Sienna wiped her eyes. "Can we frame it? Next to the photo?" "Yes," I said. "Right where it belongs." Later that night, after they'd gone, I carried the letter and the silver frame to the resort. The halls were dim and hushed, the sea visible through the glass, moonlight rippling across its surface. In the main corridor, just beyond the atrium, a new plaque had been mounted on the wall beneath the photo. Small, bronze, and simple. "The woman who built quiet empires." I smiled, tracing the engraving with my fingertip. It wasn't about wealth. It was about witness. About a life measured not in grandeur, but in grace. I placed the letter in a glass shadow box beside the frame. Together they told the whole story. A gift once mocked, a love once unseen, a truth finally revealed. As I turned to leave, the reflection in the glass caught me. Older, yes, but lighter, standing taller in the calm that follows storms. Outside, the night was serene. The ocean stretched vast and eternal, its surface silver under the moon. I stepped onto the terrace, breathing in the salt and promise. Somewhere beyond the waves, I could almost hear Thomas's voice, steady, amused, proud. "You did it, Marjorie. You let Grace do the talking." I smiled to the sky, and it spoke loud enough. Walking back along the path, lanterns lighting the way, I felt the circle close, not with triumph, but with peace. The true gift, I realized, had never been the resort, the fortune, or even the vindication. It was the quiet certainty that I had lived true to myself, that dignity, once reclaimed, can't be taken again. And as the tide rolled in, I whispered to the wind, "Forever does begin humbly, and it ends with grace."